5 armed men, 1 car, 0 exits, in the heart of Harlem. The most dangerous night of Bumpy Johnson's life lasted exactly 60 minutes, and not a single shot was fired. 72 hours before the trap was set. Bumpy already knew everything. So what did Bumpy do that made 5 armed men put their weapons down without a single order being given to understand how it all led here? We go back to where it truly began. That night. Harlem witnessed something no one had ever dared to do, and something no one ever expected to happen next. The clock on the corner of 125th Street and Lenox Avenue read 11:47, when 3 black cars rolled in from 3 different directions and sealed the intersection shut like a fist, closing around a throat. There was no warning, no horn, no shouting, just the low mechanical growl of engines cutting off simultaneously, headlights flooding the wet asphalt in cold white light. And then silence. The kind of silence that does not feel like quiet, the kind that feels like a held breath, like the entire street had suddenly forgotten how to exhale, as though the city itself had paused mid-sentence and was waiting to see how the story ended. Bumpy Johnson's car sat at the center of it all, trapped in a perfect U-shape, nowhere to go forward, nowhere to reverse, nowhere to turn without driving directly into steel and chrome and men who had been waiting a very long time for this exact moment. The rain had been falling since 9 that evening, a slow and persistent drizzle that turned the asphalt into a black mirror and made every headlight bloom into something larger and colder than it actually was. Steam rose off the pavement in thin, pale threads. A discarded paper cup tumbled across the gutter and disappeared into the dark. Somewhere above the rooftops, a pigeon shifted on a ledge, and the soft sound of its wings was the only thing moving in the whole frozen world of that intersection. Then the car doors opened. 5 men stepped out, not in a rush, not with the frantic, electric energy of people acting on impulse or adrenaline. They moved with the deliberate, unhurried calm of men who had rehearsed this exact sequence many times over and were now simply executing a script they fully believed was already finished. Their shoes connected with the wet pavement in a rhythm that was almost ceremonial. Heel, soul, heel, soul. And each step brought them 1 beat closer to the black sedan sitting motionless under the rain. They fanned out in a practiced formation, covering every angle, sealing every gap, positioning themselves with the quiet efficiency of professionals who understood that the geometry of intimidation matters as much as the tools used to enforce it. For a long moment, nothing else happened. The street was empty in every direction. Every storefront was dark behind its grate. Every window above was shut and lightless. Even the wind had gone still, as though the weather itself had decided to hold back and watch. 5 men, 1 car, 1 intersection, and the particular, unbearable quiet that only exists in the space between a decision and its consequence. That was the opening scene of the most extraordinary night in Harlem's long and complicated history. And the most extraordinary part of it had nothing to do with what those 5 men were carrying. To understand what happened in the 60 minutes that followed, you have to first understand the man sitting in that car, because Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was not the kind of man that the word kingpin was invented to describe him. He did not fill rooms with noise. He did not demand that people look at him or fear him or perform their loyalty in ways that were visible from across the street. He was, in almost every outward respect, a quietly dressed, quietly spoken man in his middle years who had a habit of carrying a book wherever he went and a tendency to listen far longer than he spoke. People who met him for the first time and did not already know who he was sometimes described him afterward as thoughtful, as measured, as the kind of person who made you feel, in the middle of a conversation, that he had already considered every direction the conversation could go before it started. Those people were not wrong. What they were describing, without quite having the language for it, was the intelligence of a man who had chosen to build his power not on fear or force, but on information, preparation, and an almost architectural understanding of how human beings make decisions under pressure. Bumpy Johnson did not rule Harlem the way a general rules a battlefield. He ruled it the way a chess player rules a board, by seeing the whole game while everyone else was focused on the piece directly in front of them. Years before that rainy night on 125th Street, Bumpy had sat across a conference table from Lucky Luciano, one of the most formidable and feared figures in the entire history of organized crime in America, and had negotiated a peace agreement that most people in that world considered impossible. The Italian syndicates had been pressing into Harlem's independent operations for years, squeezing margins, muscling out local operators, and treating the neighborhood as territory to be absorbed rather than respected. Everyone who had tried to push back had either been absorbed themselves or had simply disappeared. Bumpy walked into that meeting alone, with no armed escort, carrying only a leather briefcase and a precisely organized argument about mutual economic interest that he had spent 3 weeks constructing. He laid out the numbers. He laid out the consequences. He laid out an alternative framework that made more money for everyone involved while leaving Harlem's autonomy intact. Luciano listened without interrupting for 40 minutes, which by all accounts was something he almost never did. And when Bumpy finished, the man looked at him across the table for a long moment and said, "You're not like the others. The agreement held for 11 years. That same disciplined intelligence expressed itself in everything Bumpy did. He had taught himself criminal law during his years of incarceration, not as an academic exercise but as a practical tool, learning the architecture of the legal system well enough to understand exactly where its pressure points were, where its blind spots were, and how it could be navigated by someone who understood it from the inside out rather than simply reacting to it from the outside. He knew how evidence was weighted in different jurisdictions. He knew what a federal case required that a state case did not. He knew, down to the procedural level, how warrants were obtained and what conditions had to be met before any of them could be executed. More than one attorney who encountered him described the experience as unsettling, in the way that it is unsettling to realize that a person you expected to be at a disadvantage is operating from a stronger position than you are. And every morning, before he did anything else, he read from Sun Tzu, not the way people read things that sound authoritative on a bookshelf. He read it with a pen in his hand, the way a craftsman reads a manual for a tool he uses every day, always looking for the functional application beneath the philosophical surface. His personal copy of the book was dense with margin notes, cross-references, and carefully drawn connections between ancient principles and contemporary situations. One passage he had underlined 3 separate times, pressing hard enough with the pen that the indentation carried through several pages. In the margin beside it, in his small, even handwriting, he had written one sentence: "Never go to a battle, let the battle come to where you have already prepared." That was not a philosophy. That was a method. And it was the method that had been running quietly in the background of every decision made in the 72 hours leading up to that intersection. Snake Dupree had come to Harlem from Brooklyn 6 months before that night, and he arrived with the particular energy of a man who has outgrown one space and is entirely certain he is ready for the next one. He was 28 years old, lean and sharp-eyed, with the kind of quick intelligence that processes situations fast and the kind of confidence that sometimes moves faster than the intelligence beneath it. He had built his Brooklyn operation from almost nothing into something with genuine structural weight, and that accomplishment, real as it was, had given him a belief in his own judgment that was almost total. Snake had looked at Harlem and seen what he believed was a market governed by tradition rather than efficiency. An old man holding on to territory through reputation rather than active strength. A situation ripe for someone young and decisive enough to move on it. He was not entirely wrong in his analysis. What he was wrong about was the nature of the old man he was analyzing. His plan for the night of the 23rd was evaluated on its own terms, genuinely impressive. He had spent 3 weeks observing Bumpy's movements, mapping the rhythms of his evenings, identifying patterns and exceptions with the patience of someone who understood that good intelligence was more valuable than a larger force. He had located the one evening each month when Bumpy made a solitary drive through the neighborhood, a private ritual Bumpy had maintained for years. A quiet hour alone in the streets he had spent his life navigating, and had identified it correctly as the single genuine gap in an otherwise close to impenetrable personal security arrangement. He had recruited 5 experienced men and positioned them with real tactical intelligence. He had planned the timing so that all 3 blocking vehicles converged within 3 seconds of each other, closing the trap before any instinctive response could formulate itself into action. The objective was not violence. Snake understood clearly that removing Bumpy through force would trigger a chain of consequences that no one operating in that world could afford, repercussions that would travel outward through every connected organization from New York to Chicago and find their way back to the source, regardless of how carefully the source had tried to cover itself. What he wanted was a document, a signed transfer of operational authority over the 3 most profitable distribution corridors in Upper Harlem. A piece of paper that would announce to every paying attention that Snake Dupree had accomplished the thing no one else had managed, that he had made Bumpy Johnson bend a knee. He had worked through every contingency he could imagine, every angle of resistance, every possible response from a man caught in a position of total physical disadvantage. He had built the plan around the foundational assumption that surprise, combined with overwhelming numerical control of the space, would be enough to overcome even the most experienced and level-headed operator. And he had executed the preparation with genuine care. There was precisely one variable he had not accounted for, and it was the only variable that mattered. He believed Bumpy did not know. 72 hours before those 3 cars rolled into the intersection, a man named Calvin Reese walked into a barbershop on 118th Street at 20 minutes past 2 in the afternoon and sat down in the waiting area without making an appointment. He exchanged pleasantries with the barber for several minutes, declined a cut. He said he did not actually need that day, and left. What he left behind, folded beneath the cushion of the waiting chair, was a single sheet of paper containing the complete operational details of Snake Dupree's plan: the date, the precise time, the intersection, the number of men involved, the number and positions of the blocking vehicles, and the nature of the objective. Calvin Reese had been Snake's most trusted lieutenant for 4 years. He had been present at the founding of the Brooklyn operation, had helped build it through periods of genuine difficulty, and had been rewarded for that loyalty with access to information that Snake shared with almost no one else. Calvin was the person Snake called when a decision needed to be made at 3 in the morning. He was the person Snake trusted to know the difference between information that needed to stay quiet and information that could be shared. He was, by every measure that Snake applied to the people around him, the one person in the organization who was completely solid. Calvin had reached that barbershop because he had done a calculation that Snake had not given him credit for being capable of doing. He had looked at the plan for the night of the 23rd, looked at the man the plan was targeting, and arrived at a conclusion with the cold, quiet certainty of someone who has done genuine arithmetic rather than wishful thinking. Snake was brilliant at 3 moves ahead. Bumpy Johnson lived 12 moves ahead. And Calvin, who had observed both men, knew exactly what that gap meant for everyone standing in the vicinity when the distance between those 2 levels of thinking became visible. He did not want to be standing in that vicinity when it happened. What Bumpy did when the piece of paper arrived was not what most people would have done, And it was not what Snake would have predicted if he had known about it, which is precisely the point. Bumpy did not mobilize a response. He did not cancel the evening drive. He did not send word to Snake that the plan had been compromised. He read the paper once, set it down beside his copy of Sun Tzu, and picked up a pen. Over the following 72 hours, Bumpy Johnson did not prevent Snake's plan from happening. He walked inside it, rearranged every piece of furniture, and locked the door from the inside. He compiled a complete profile on each of the 5 recruited men, their names, their histories, their families, their debts, their daily patterns. Drawing on a network of relationships and information sources he had spent 20 years building across every block of Upper Manhattan. He then assigned one of his own people to each man, with a single specific task that required nothing more than a brief, unremarkable moment of proximity. A shared lighter on a corner, a brushed shoulder on a crowded stoop, a handed-back dropped item outside a diner. In each case, the contact lasted under 30 seconds. In each case, it was enough. By the evening of the 23rd, every firearm belonging to every one of those 5 men had been rendered silently, invisibly, completely inoperable through a small mechanical adjustment that left no visible trace and that none of them had any reason to check for. He then positioned 11 of his own people across the full length of that block, each one occupying a role that explained their presence without requiring any explanation at all. A newspaper vendor who had never worked that corner before, a woman standing at a bus stop for a bus that did not run that late, a man crouched in a doorway over a bicycle chain that happened to need attention for a very long time. A couple paused under a broken awning, having a conversation that appeared to be about something personal. 11 people, 11 positions. Every angle of that intersection covered, every point of access observed, every possible development accounted for before it could develop. Finally, through Calvin, he sent Snake one last piece of information, a small, carefully chosen detail about the evening's timing that ensured Snake's convoy would arrive at the intersection at exactly 11:47 and not a single minute before or after. Bumpy did not avoid the trap. He accepted it completely, rebuilt it from the inside out, and then drove into it at the appointed hour with the unhurried composure of a man arriving at a location he had personally chosen. The car door swung open with a clean, solid, metallic sound that belonged to a well-made thing operating as it was designed to. And in the charged silence of that intersection, it landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending invisible ripples in every direction. The man who reached inside did not speak. He gripped Bumpy's arm with the firm, practiced pressure of someone delivering a physical message. There is no point in resistance. The time for alternatives has already passed, and Bumpy stepped out of the vehicle without hesitation, without struggle, with the calm and unhurried bearing of a man stepping out at a destination he had selected himself. He straightened his jacket. He looked briefly at the wet pavement beneath his shoes. He looked at the 5 men positioned around him. And then he looked up. Snake Dupree came forward from between 2 of the blocking vehicles, moving with the measured confidence of a man who had mentally rehearsed his entrance many times and was now delivering it to an audience he had already decided was captive. He was wearing a dark coat with the collar raised against the rain, and he stopped at a precise distance from Bumpy, close enough to be heard clearly without raising his voice, far enough to maintain the visual grammar of authority. He let the silence between them sit for a moment, giving it weight, letting it do the work that silence does when the person using it believes the situation is already decided. "Tonight you retire, Bumpy," he said. His voice was level, almost gentle, carrying the particular quality of restraint that belongs to people who feel they no longer need volume to make a point. "No drama, no mess. You sign what I have in my pocket. You go home. And everybody walks away clean. That's all this needs to be. The rain fell. Somewhere at the far end of the block, a shutter knocked against a window frame in the wind. Nothing else moved anywhere in the world. Bumpy looked at Snake with the focused, unhurried attention of someone reading a document they have been handed and want to understand completely before responding. He held that gaze for several long seconds, and then, slowly and with great deliberateness, he raised his left wrist and looked at his watch. He examined it the way a person examines something that contains specific information they have been waiting to confirm. He looked at it for a full 4 seconds. Then he lowered his wrist, looked back at Snake, and the expression on his face was not the expression of any moment that Snake had prepared for. He was smiling. 3 minutes late, Bumpy said. His voice was completely composed, carrying the relaxed, conversational quality of someone making an observation about the weather. You're 3 minutes late. Did some of your boys have trouble finding the street? The smile held, and in the particular quality of that smile, unhurried, unforced, carrying no desperation and no performance, was something that bypassed Snake's conscious reasoning entirely and reached directly into the instinctive part of him that evaluated danger. Because those words did not belong to a surprised man. They did not belong to a man buying time or reaching for control. He didn't actually have. They belonged to a man who had written the schedule himself, had been watching it run, and was mildly noting that one of its components had arrived slightly behind the planned timeline. Snake's confidence did not break. It fractured a single hairline crack. Impossible to see from the outside, but impossible not to feel from the inside. He could feel it spreading through the foundation of everything he had built over the past 3 weeks. Every careful calculation and contingency. Every assumption he had made about what this moment would look like and who would be in control of it. 7 words. One of Snake's own men would say months later, when enough distance had accumulated that he felt he could speak about that night. The man said 7 words, and something in the whole plan just shifted. Like the ground moved. Like we'd been standing on something and suddenly we weren't anymore. Snake Dupree had walked into that intersection carrying a document, 5 armed men, and the absolute certainty that he had accounted for every possible version of what could happen next. What he had not accounted for was that the man standing in the rain in front of him had spent 72 hours making sure that the only version of that night that could happen was the one Bumpy Johnson had already written. Snake stood in the rain with 5 armed men at his back and a signed document waiting in his coat pocket. And for one long, suspended moment, he told himself that the smile meant nothing, that it was a performance, that a man caught with no options and no visible way out reaches for whatever psychological leverage he can find in the final seconds before the situation closes around him completely. Snake told himself this because he needed it to be true, and because the alternative, that the smile was genuine, that it belonged to a man who was exactly where he had chosen to be, was a door his mind was not yet ready to open. So he waited. And Bumpy began to talk. He did not raise his voice. He did not shift his weight or adjust his posture or do anything that suggested he felt the need to manage the physical dimensions of what was happening around him. He simply stood in the rain in his carefully pressed jacket, hands completely relaxed at his sides, and turned his attention to the 5 men positioned around the vehicle with the calm, methodical focus of a professor beginning a lecture he has given many times and expects to give many times again. "Marcus," he said, turning slightly toward the man standing at the rear left corner of the sedan. "How is Denise doing? I heard the delivery was difficult." "3rd floor. Harlem Hospital. Last Tuesday. Baby girl. You named her after your mother." The man named Marcus did not move. but something in his face changed in a way that had nothing to do with the visible movement of muscles and everything to do with what was happening several layers beneath them. A stillness arrived that was not calm. The stillness of a person who has just been handed information that should not, by any reasonable understanding of how the world works, have been available to the person handing it. Bumpy was already turning before the stillness had fully settled. Dion, the second man, positioned at the front right corner, standing with his weight slightly forward in the practice stance of someone braced for a specific kind of physical action. You still owe Chico $400 from August. He mentioned to me that he has been patient about it, but patience has a natural expiration date. I would take care of that before the end of the month if I were you. Dion's weight shifted backward. It was a small movement, barely perceptible in any other context, but in the compressed and total silence of that intersection, it registered as clearly as a spoken word. His body had responded before his mind had finished deciding whether to respond, which is what bodies do when they receive information so far outside expected parameters that the ordinary sequence of thought and reaction gets reversed. "Ray!" Bumpy looked toward the man standing farthest from the car, at the outermost edge of the headlight's reach, where the white light dissolved into ordinary darkness. "Your mother still sits on the front step on Malcolm X every morning. 7 o'clock. Cup of coffee. Reads the paper before the neighborhood gets loud. She told Mrs. Patterson next door that she worries about you more than she lets on. You should call her more than you do." Ray took one step backward. He did not appear to make a conscious decision to take it. His body simply moved. The way bodies move when the mind receives something it was not configured to receive and acts on pure instinct before reason can impose itself. He stopped after one step and held his position with visible effort. But the step had happened, and every person standing in that intersection had registered it, and the registering of it changed something in the collective atmosphere of the space in a way that could not be reversed. What was unfolding in that intersection was not a demonstration of force in any form that Snake had prepared to counter. There was no threat concealed in Bumpy's words, no sharpened edge underneath the surface of them. No implication that the information he was sharing was being aimed like a weapon with a specific target in mind. That was precisely what made it so completely destabilizing. A threat has a shape. A threat has a direction and a set of possible responses that a prepared mind can begin to organize itself around, building defenses and calculating options and constructing the architecture of a countermove. What Bumpy was doing carried none of that familiar structure. He was stating facts, private, specific, granular facts about the intimate lives of 5 men who had arrived at this intersection, in the full belief that they were unknown to him, and the effect was something that no tactical preparation in the world could have anticipated or addressed. Because the question quietly detonating inside each of those 5 men had nothing to do with what Bumpy intended to do with what he knew. The question was something far more disorienting, far more corrosive to confidence and to the sense of solid ground that people in their profession depended on to function. The question was, how does he know any of this? How does a man who was supposed to be walking blindly into a trap know the name of a baby born in a hospital 3 weeks ago? Know the exact figure of a private debt between 2 people who had never spoken his name? Know the daily morning ritual of a woman on a street that none of these men had ever mentioned to anyone outside their own front doors? How long has this network been watching? How deep does it reach? And if he knows this much about 5 men recruited for a single operation, what does he know about everyone else? And how long has he known it? And what has he chosen to do with it, and what has he chosen to hold? The 5th man positioned at the left front corner, closest to the driver's door, the one who had not yet been addressed, had been standing with increasing rigidity as each name was called before him. The waiting was, in its own particular way, worse than being called. He stood completely still with his hands at his sides and his eyes moving in rapid, searching arcs between Bumpy and the other 4 men. The eyes of someone scanning a room for an exit that they are beginning to understand does not exist. Snake watched all of this happen in real time and felt the hairline fracture from 60 seconds ago, propagating through the foundation of everything he had constructed with such deliberate care over the past 3 weeks. He recognized what Bumpy was doing. He was smart enough to recognize it, but recognition did not give him a tool to stop it. He could see the psychological architecture of it clearly. He simply could not interrupt it. It was already inside his men, working at a level where commands and orders had no reach. He made a decision, the only decision that felt like it still belonged to him. "Enough," he said, and his voice came out with more force than a man in full control needs to use, which revealed more than he intended it to. "We're finished talking. Do what we came here to do." He looked at the man standing closest to Bumpy and gave one sharp, unambiguous nod. The trigger was pulled. The sound it made was the dry, hollow, mechanical sound of metal completing its intended motion, and finding nothing behind it, a click so small and so completely wrong in that context that for a fraction of a second, the man holding the weapon simply stared at it. His face wearing the expression of a person who has performed a deeply familiar action and received an outcome so contrary to every expectation built into every repetition of that action that the brain requires additional processing time to accept it as real data rather than error. He pulled the trigger a second time. The same sound, smaller than a whisper, louder than anything else in the world. "Again," Snake said. His voice had shed the last remnants of its earlier composure. What remained was something tighter and higher pitched, with a tension running through it that communicated, to everyone close enough to hear it, exactly how much of his confidence over the past hour had been load-bearing structure rather than genuine solidity. The second man raised his weapon and pulled the trigger. The third, the fourth, the fifth, each pull producing the same result, that same empty, mechanical, devastating click that traveled across the wet asphalt and bounced off the dark facades of the surrounding buildings, and came back diminished and hollow and completely, absolutely final. 5 weapons, 5 men, 5 identical outcomes. The geometry of the trap that Snake had so carefully designed had just been inverted in the space of 30 seconds, and everyone standing in that intersection understood this simultaneously, in the particular way that understanding arrives when it is not being reasoned toward but simply received. Bumpy watched the sequence reach its conclusion with the patient, attentive expression of someone observing a process they understand completely play out toward its predetermined end. He gave the silence that followed exactly 3 full seconds, which was long enough to let the weight of it settle fully onto every person present. Then he spoke, and his voice carried the same unhurried, conversational quality it had held since the moment he stepped out of the car. He explained, not quickly, not with the compressed urgency of someone filling in details to close an argument, but deliberately, taking each element in the order it had been arranged and laying it out with the clarity of someone who wants the structure of a thing to be fully understood, not merely accepted. The newspaper vendor at the north end of the block had been working that corner for 11 days. Not his regular corner. He had relocated specifically, and the relocation had been planned to place him in natural, unremarkable daily contact with each of the 5 men during their weeks of preparatory surveillance of the area. He had offered papers. He had made conversation. He had been, to every observer, exactly what he appeared to be, a neighborhood fixture who had always been there and would always be there. Over the course of 4 separate encounters across 11 days, he had been in proximity to holsters and jacket pockets for cumulative intervals, that added up to less than 2 minutes of total contact time. 2 minutes was more than enough. The woman at the bus stop on the east side of the intersection had been standing there since 10 that evening. She was not waiting for a bus. The last bus on that route had stopped running at 9, a fact that anyone who lived in the neighborhood knew, and that anyone surveilling the block without living there would not have thought to verify. Her position gave her an unobstructed sightline to the storage vehicle Snake's crew used for equipment, and she had needed that sightline for a specific window in the early part of the evening. She had used it. The boy on the bicycle who had collided with the rear blocking vehicle in what appeared to be a clumsy accident at around 10:45 had apologized at considerable length and had spent several minutes crouched near the bumper, helping to assess potential damage. During those several minutes he had accomplished 2 things at once, and neither of them had anything to do with the bumper. The couple under the broken awning, the man working on a bicycle chain in a doorway, the vendor with the cart at the south end of the block. Each one placed, each one tasked, each one finished and in position before 11 o'clock. 11 people, Bumpy said, with the tone of someone completing an inventory. Every one of them on this block before your first vehicle turned onto the street. You built a very precise operation, Snake. You designed the room carefully. You just didn't know that someone else had been living in it for 2 weeks before you arrived. Snake said nothing. He was standing with a particular quality of stillness that was different from the deliberate stillness of a man maintaining composure. It was the stillness of a man whose internal processing has been temporarily overwhelmed by the volume and velocity of information arriving from too many directions at once, and who has gone quiet not from strength, but from the temporary suspension of the mechanisms that generate response. The crack had become a fracture. The fracture was becoming something larger. And then Bumpy turned his head slightly, looked past Snake's left shoulder, and spoke 3 words to someone standing behind him. "Calvin, it's time." The effect of those words was not gradual. It was immediate, total, and visible in every person standing in that intersection simultaneously. The 5 men with empty weapons turned toward Calvin. Snake turned toward Calvin, and Calvin stood exactly where he had been standing for the past 20 minutes, 2 steps behind Snake's left shoulder, and went through a sequence of expressions in the space of approximately 4 seconds that told the entire story without a single word being spoken. Surprise that was not quite surprise because some part of him had known this moment was coming. A brief flash of calculation that found no available options, and then a resignation that settled into his features with the slow, irreversible quality of something reaching its natural conclusion. He did not speak. He did not move. And his silence and his stillness were, in that context, the most complete and devastating confirmation possible. Bumpy reached into his jacket and produced a folded sheet of paper. He did not hand it to Snake immediately. He held it at his side for a moment, giving the weight of what it represented time to register before its contents were revealed. 3 days ago, he said, Calvin came to find me. Not because I approached him, not because I pressured him or offered him something he couldn't refuse. He came because he is a careful man, and careful men are able to distinguish between a structure that will hold and a structure that is going to come down, and they make their decisions based on that distinction, rather than on loyalty to something they can see is already falling. He extended the paper toward Snake. This is a complete record. Every meeting, every location, every date and time. Several sections in his own handwriting. So there is no question about the source or its reliability. Snake took the paper with the hands of a man accepting something he has no choice but to accept. He unfolded it. He read the first 4 lines. He stopped. He looked up at Calvin, and Calvin held his gaze for exactly 1 second before looking away toward the ground. And in that 1 second, and in that looking away was a confirmation so absolute and so complete that the document became almost secondary. The document was evidence. What had just passed between Snake's eyes and Calvin's was the truth beneath the evidence, acknowledged and received and impossible to dispute or reframe or absorb into any version of events that left Snake's understanding of his own organization intact. He had trusted Calvin with everything, with the inside of every decision, every contingency, every vulnerability, and every plan he had built over 4 years. He had believed, with the kind of deep and tested certainty that only accumulates through years of demonstrated reliability, that Calvin was the one completely solid thing in an organization where everything else required constant monitoring and maintenance. That belief had been the foundation on which tonight's plan rested, and the foundation had been compromised before the plan had even been fully formed. The understanding that moved through Snake in that moment was not simply the understanding that Calvin had informed on him. It was the understanding of something larger and more structurally devastating than the confidence he had carried into Harlem 6 months ago. The certainty that had made him bold enough to challenge the man standing in front of him had been built on ground that was not solid, had never been solid, had been, for longer than he could now calculate, being quietly and methodically prepared for exactly this collapse by a man who had seen it coming before Snake had taken his first step. He had lost before he began. The only question he had never thought to ask was exactly when. The silence that followed had a different character from every silence that had come before it that night. Earlier silences had been charged with the potential energy of things not yet decided, taut with the tension of a situation still in motion. This silence was the silence of completion of a conclusion reached, and a result that everyone present could now perceive with the full, unobstructed clarity that only becomes available after the last piece has fallen into its final position. Bumpy reached into his jacket a second time and produced a manila envelope, plain and unremarkable in appearance, the kind of envelope that suggests administrative content before it is opened. He held it out, and Snake took it, and the weight of it communicated something significant before the flap was lifted. This was not a few pages. This was an organized, comprehensive file. The kind of file that belongs to a project that someone has been building patiently and methodically over an extended period of time. Snake opened it. He looked at the first document. He turned to the second. He did not finish reading either one completely before he understood what he was holding, because the details visible in the first few lines of each page were sufficient: the dates, the specificity of the documented transactions, the cross-referenced sources that he recognized as genuine without being able to immediately identify how they had been accessed. This had not been assembled in the past 72 hours. This predated the plan for tonight by months. This was the work of a man who had understood that a moment of reckoning was an eventual certainty, and had prepared for it with the thoroughness that only comes from beginning the preparation long before the specific shape of that moment is known. 3 federal-level offenses, documented in the kind of complete and organized detail that removes all ambiguity from the word sufficient. 30 years was not a figure being used for rhetorical effect. It was a fair and conservative estimate by any standard of actual legal calculation. Bumpy allowed Snake to hold the envelope in silence for a long moment, and then he spoke for what would be the final time that evening, and his voice carried the same quality throughout that it had carried from the beginning, unhurried, completely without heat, carrying the particular authority that belongs not to force, but to someone who has had more time to think about a situation than anyone else in the room, and shows it not by announcing it, but by not needing to. "I am going to keep the original of everything in that envelope," he said. "You are going to return to Brooklyn. You are going to live quietly and without incident, and you are not going to bring your ambitions anywhere near this neighborhood again. That arrangement costs you nothing and preserves everything you have left." He paused for exactly the right duration. "If your name reaches me from Harlem, not your face, not your operation, just your name, that file goes to the federal building the same day. No conversation before it happens. No warning. No second version of this offer." He straightened his jacket with the same small, precise gesture he had made when he stepped out of the car. The gesture of a man completing one thing and preparing to move to the next, for whom this entire evening had been an item on a longer list rather than the sum total of something. "You came here tonight to make me step down," Bumpy said, and for the first time in the entire evening there was something beneath the calm in his voice, not triumph, not cruelty, but something older and quieter and more fundamental than either of those things. The tone of a man stating a truth that requires no decoration because it carries its own weight completely. "I think what has become clear is that the retirement being discussed tonight was never mine." He walked back to his car. The door opened and closed with the same clean, solid sound it had made when it opened from the outside 20 minutes earlier. Except that this time, the sound had an entirely different meaning. The way the same word spoken in two different moments can carry two completely different worlds inside it. The engine started. The headlights swept the intersection as the car turned. And for one brief moment, the light passed directly across Snake's face, the envelope in one hand, the folded paper in the other. 5 men around him with weapons that had never fired. And a lieutenant 2 steps behind him who was looking at the ground and would continue to look at the ground for a very long time. The black sedan moved away from the intersection at the same unhurried pace it had always traveled at, and the sound of its engine faded gradually. And then the intersection was quiet again except for the rain, which had been falling through the entire evening without pause and which continued now without any awareness that something extraordinary had just concluded. Snake walked away from Harlem that night with his body completely unharmed, and every other thing he had brought with him, gone beyond any realistic possibility of recovery. But what Bumpy had truly taken from him on that wet intersection, the thing that no amount of time or distance or reinvention could restore, was not his plan. Not his leverage, not the ambition that had carried him from Brooklyn with such certainty. It was something quieter and far more total than any of those things, something that a man in Snake's world cannot function without, cannot rebuild once it is gone, and cannot explain to anyone who has never felt its absence. And Snake Dupree would spend the rest of his life understanding, in the specific and private way that only direct experience teaches, exactly what that thing was. Harlem woke the next morning the way it always did, with noise, with motion, with the particular restless energy of a neighborhood that has never in its history waited for permission to begin its day. The vendors rolled out their carts. The children moved toward school in loose, unhurried clusters. The smell of coffee and fried bread drifted from open kitchen windows and mixed with the cold morning air that still carried traces of the previous night's rain. On the surface, nothing was different. The intersection of 125th Street and Lenox Avenue looked exactly as it always looked at 7 in the morning, ordinary, unremarkable, carrying no visible evidence of what had taken place there 8 hours earlier. And yet something had changed in the atmosphere of the neighborhood, in the specific way that atmospheres change when something significant has happened, that everyone has absorbed, but no one has yet spoken aloud. By mid-morning, without any single identifiable source, without any account being given in full by any person who claimed to have been present, the story was everywhere. Not in the form of a detailed narrative with a beginning and an end and a reliable chain of witnesses. In the form of fragments, a sentence here, a knowing look there, a pause in a conversation that communicated more than the words surrounding it. People who had been nowhere near 125th Street the previous night spoke about what had happened with the quiet certainty of people describing something they had not witnessed but understood completely. Snake Dupree's name was mentioned once, briefly, and then not again. It did not need to be mentioned again. His absence from every conversation that followed was itself a kind of statement. The way a chair that has been removed from a room says something specific about the room that the chair itself never could. Nobody could explain afterward how the story had traveled so completely without anyone appearing to tell it. But that was, in its own way, the most accurate reflection of what the story was actually about. The drive back from 125th Street had taken 11 minutes, and for the first 9 of those minutes the car was completely silent. The city moved past the windows in the way it moves at midnight, emptied of its daytime density, reduced to pools of light and stretches of shadow, and the occasional figure moving with the purposeful solitude of someone who has somewhere specific to be, at an hour when most people do not. Bumpy sat in the back seat and looked out the window at the neighborhood he had spent his entire adult life inside. And his expression was the expression of a man thinking about something he has thought about many times before and has never quite finished thinking about. His driver. A man who had worked for him for 9 years and had learned over those 9 years that silence in the back seat was usually more meaningful than conversation. Kept his eyes on the road and said nothing. It was Bumpy who finally spoke. Not loudly, not in the tone of someone making an announcement, but in the reflective, unhurried voice of a man working something out. "A gun ends one person," he said. "One moment, one decision, one result. But the truth ends an entire empire, because once a man's people see what he actually is, once they understand the distance between what he told them and what was real, there is no recovering from that. You can rebuild after force. You cannot rebuild after that." The driver did not respond, and Bumpy did not seem to require a response. He was not explaining himself to anyone. He was simply stating, in the quiet of a car moving through a sleeping city, the principle that had governed every decision he had made that evening and, in a larger sense, every significant decision he had made for the past 2 decades. What Snake Dupree had lost on 125th Street was not a plan. Plans fail and are replaced. It was not a document or a set of weapons or even the loyalty of one lieutenant. Though the loss of Calvin had its own particular weight, what he had lost was the thing that makes every other thing in that world possible, the belief of the people around him that he was something more than he actually was. That belief is not rebuilt by returning with a better plan or more men or a different approach. It is the kind of thing that, once visibly removed, leaves a shape behind it that everyone can see and no one can pretend is not there. Snake's men had watched him give an order that produced nothing. They had watched the architecture of his certainty dismantle itself in real time. They had watched him receive an envelope from the man he had come to conquer and stand in the rain holding it without a word to say. Whatever they had followed him for, whatever quality they had attributed to him that made his direction worth accepting, that quality had not survived the intersection of 125th Street and Lenox Avenue, and every one of them knew it. And Snake knew that they knew it, and that shared knowledge was more final than any other outcome the evening could have produced. By the time the car reached its destination and the engine went quiet, Bumpy had already moved on from the thought entirely. He thanked his driver with the same brief, genuine courtesy he always used, walked upstairs and settled into the chair by the window that he had occupied on more mornings than he could count. The copy of Langston Hughes on the side table was open to a page he had read many times, worn at the corner from the number of times his thumb had found it in the dark without needing to look. The lamp made a small warm circle on the page and on his hands and on the arm of the chair. And outside the window, Harlem was beginning its morning in full, the voices rising, the movement thickening, the neighborhood assembling itself out of individual lives into something collective and alive and entirely its own. He could hear it without needing to look at it. He had always been able to hear it. It was the sound he had organized his entire life around protecting. He read the line at the bottom of the open page. He had read it so many times that the reading was almost secondary to the knowing the words already present in him before his eyes reached them. Arriving the way familiar music arrives, recognized before it is fully heard. I, too, am America. He sat with it for a moment, the way you sit with something that contains more than it appears to contain on the surface. Then he closed the book gently, set it back on the table, and looked out at the window, at the city coming to life below him, loud and complicated and undefeated, full of people who had been told in 100 different ways that they did not belong to the thing they had built with their own hands, and who had gone on building it anyway. That was what he had always understood, that men like Snake could never quite grasp, that the neighborhood was not a market to be captured or a territory to be held. It was something living, something that remembered, something that knew the difference between a man who was using it and a man who belonged to it, and something, in its own unhurried and collective way, that always made that distinction visible in the end. The most dangerous man in any room is not the one holding the most power in his hands. It is the one who has already decided, long before the room fills, exactly how the evening is going to end, and has spent the time since making sure that nothing in the world can make it end any other way.